The flip side of Custer's legacy, the truth behind Little Bighorn. On a sweltering summer day, June 25, 1876, a battle raged on the plains of Montana that would forever be etched into the annals of American history. The Battle of Little Bighorn is known to many as the day George Armstrong Custer and his Seventh Cavalry were wiped out by Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. But beneath the surface of this oft-told tale lies a story far more complex, woven from the threads of ambition, miscalculation, and a catastrophic series of decisions. To truly understand Custer's last stand, we must go beyond the simplistic legends and delve into the heart of that fateful day, where conflicting accounts, faulty timing, and hubris converged to seal the fate of the Seventh Cavalry. What really happened in those critical hours? How could a man celebrated for his military prowess lead his troops to their deaths? And why have historians spent nearly 150 years debating the facts of this tragic event? The answers lie not only in the battle itself, but in the days, hours, and even minutes leading up to it. Every moment, every decision, and every misstep contributed to a defeat so devastating that it continues to spark controversy today. The truth is not merely in the final moments of Custer's life, but in the events that set him on an irreversible path to disaster. Setting the stage, a dangerous game begins. The lead-up to the Battle of Little Bighorn was as complex and tense as the day itself. By June 25, 1876, the U.S. government's expansion into Native American territories had pushed tensions to a boiling point. The Sioux and Cheyenne, united under the spiritual and strategic leadership of Sitting Bull, had gathered in a massive encampment along the Little Bighorn River, resolutely determined to protect their way of life. The U.S. military, under orders to force native tribes onto reservations and further reduce their land holdings, had turned its attention to breaking this powerful resistance. George Armstrong Custer, a bold and controversial figure, was leading the Seventh Cavalry on a mission to subdue these native forces and enforce the government's will. Custer was a man of contradictions, hailed as a hero by some for his battlefield audacity, yet criticized by others for his vanity and recklessness. It was these very traits that would soon send him down a perilous road, one from which he and his men would never return. On the morning of June 25th, as the 7th Cavalry prepared to leave their camp near Busby, a palpable sense of urgency swept through the ranks. Custer had been tracking Sitting Bull's massive encampment for days and knew that time was running out. Every hour of delay could mean the difference between catching the native forces by surprise or allowing them to escape and regroup. The exact moment of Custer's departure has since become a focal point of historical debate. Was Custer riding alongside his men, overseeing the movements of his battalion as a disciplined commander? Or had he, in typical Custer fashion, galloped ahead on his own, scouting the terrain with a headstrong eagerness to engage the enemy? This seemingly trivial detail holds significant implications for understanding Custer's mindset and the unfolding of events. If Custer had indeed separated himself from his troops, it might suggest a dangerous mixture of impatience and overconfidence. It could imply that he was acting on instinct, blinded by his own belief in his invincibility and eager to secure a swift and decisive victory. On the other hand, if Custer remained with his men, his actions would appear more measured and deliberate. But even in that scenario, one must ask, would it have made a difference? As the regiment moved toward the Little Bighorn, the stage was set for a sequence of events where timing became an invisible but decisive factor. The regiment's progress from the Busby camp to their first major stop, known as Halt 1, marks the beginning of the unraveling of Custer's ill-fated strategy. What was meant to be a methodical military maneuver quickly descended into confusion and chaos. The exact timing of this halt remains unclear, and its purpose has been interpreted in several ways. Was this a brief rest for the cavalry as they prepared for a final push toward the Sioux and Cheyenne encampment? Or was it meant as a calculated pause, allowing Custer and his scouts to gather crucial intelligence before proceeding into the heart of enemy territory? Some accounts suggest that Custer himself was present during the halt, organizing his forces for the next phase of the mission. Others, however, imply that Custer had already ridden ahead, leaving his men to follow his lead without direct guidance. This uncertainty over Custer's presence at Halt 1 is a key factor in understanding how his strategy began to disintegrate. In battle, timing can be the difference between a well-executed plan and a disastrous failure. On this day, time was slipping through Custer's fingers. The regiment's movements became disjointed, and the cohesion of his command began to break down. Custer's haste, whether motivated by a reckless desire to claim glory or a genuine fear of losing the initiative, would soon prove to be his undoing. Every minute lost to confusion, miscommunication, or hesitation brought the Seventh Cavalry closer to disaster. As the regiment pressed onward, the fog of war thickened. Custer's men were not merely marching into enemy territory, they were walking into the unknown. The vastness of the landscape and the complexity of the terrain added to the challenges they faced. Rolling hills, deep ravines, and the unpredictable nature of the environment made it difficult to gauge the location and strength of the native forces they were about to engage. Custer, still driven by his belief that the Sioux and Cheyenne would scatter at the sight of his cavalry, pressed forward, unaware that he was leading his men into an ambush. The battle that was supposed to secure his legacy as a victorious commander was instead setting the stage for one of the greatest defeats in American military history. The march to disaster, confusion reigns. As Custer's soldiers advanced into the wild and rugged terrain of southern Montana, they found themselves in a landscape that was as physically challenging as it was mentally treacherous. The rolling hills and steep ravines of the Little Bighorn Valley created an ideal setting for an ambush, but Custer, ever confident in his abilities, pushed forward without fully appreciating the dangers that lay ahead. The Sioux and Cheyenne forces, numbering in the thousands, and led by the likes of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, had not fled in panic as Custer hoped. Instead, they were patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. The ground Custer's men now traversed was no ordinary battlefield. It was a trap, carefully set by warriors who had spent their lives defending their homeland against encroachment. Amid this increasingly perilous situation, one figure stands out as pivotal: Fred Girard, the interpreter for the Arikara scouts accompanying Custer's expedition. At 46 years old, Girard was an experienced frontiersman who had seen his share of battles. His reputation, though later debated by historians, was solid at the time, and he played a critical role in the events leading up to the battle. As the regiment neared the Sioux and Cheyenne village, Girard's observations became increasingly important. He reported to Custer that the native forces were not fleeing as initially believed. This simple yet crucial piece of intelligence would dramatically alter the course of the day's events. Girard's report reached Custer just as the regiment was preparing for a potential engagement. It was a moment when caution might have been advisable, but Custer interpreted the report with characteristic certainty. In Custer's mind, the absence of a fleeing enemy was not cause for concern. It was an opportunity. He believed that the Sioux and Cheyenne were retreating, and he was determined to strike before they could fully escape. This belief became the driving force behind Custer's next move, as he ordered his men to advance swiftly and decisively. His aggressive tactics, shaped by an eagerness to claim victory, would soon lead his troops directly into the jaws of their enemies. The truth, as Girard and others on the ground saw it, was far different from Custer's interpretation. The native forces were not retreating, they were preparing for battle. What Custer mistook for disarray and flight was in fact a well-organized defense. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were ready to meet the Seventh Cavalry head-on, and by the time Custer realized the gravity of his error, it was already too late. The regiment had marched into a trap, one from which there would be no escape. The sequence of events becomes even clearer when we examine the testimonies of those who survived the battle. George Herendeen, one of Custer's scouts, later gave a detailed account of the moments leading up to the fight. According to Herendeen, the regiment moved in stages, with Custer riding ahead to scout the terrain and assess the situation. Yet this version of events conflicts with other eyewitness reports, which suggest that Custer may have stayed with his men throughout the advance. The confusion surrounding Custer's exact whereabouts only adds to the complexity of the battle's narrative. It is possible that Custer's movements were disjointed, contributing to the breakdown of communication and coordination among his forces. As Custer pressed onward, unaware of the full extent of the danger lurking around him, the native warriors prepared to strike. Armed with bows, arrows, rifles, and the unyielding determination to defend their lands, the Sioux and Cheyenne vastly outnumbered the Seventh Cavalry. They had no intention of retreating. Instead, they were ready to launch a ferocious counterattack. Custer, still believing that his enemies were scattered and on the run, continued to advance, oblivious to the fact that the warriors were closing in around him. When the battle finally erupted, it was not the swift and decisive victory Custer had envisioned. Instead, it was a brutal and one-sided massacre. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, quickly overwhelmed Custer's men. Within hours, the 7th Cavalry was decimated. Custer himself, along with nearly all of his troops, lay dead on the battlefield, victims of a catastrophic failure of judgment and strategy. The events of June 25, 1876, would go down in history as one of the most tragic and controversial military engagements in American history. What began as an attempt to subdue native forces and secure a quick victory ended in the annihilation of an entire command. The confusion, miscommunication, and overconfidence that marked Custer's march to disaster serve as a cautionary tale, reminding us that even the most seasoned commanders can fall victim to their own hubris. For Custer and his men, the march to Little Bighorn was not merely a journey into battle, it was a march toward oblivion. The moment of reckoning, a battle doomed to fail. By early afternoon on June 25, 1876, the Battle of Little Bighorn was set to become one of the bloodiest encounters in U.S. military history. Custer's 7th Cavalry, split into several battalions, was overwhelmed by a vastly larger and more determined force than anticipated. Fewer than 300 men under Custer's direct command found themselves surrounded by thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors fighting to protect their way of life. The native forces, led by formidable chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, were far better prepared than Custer had imagined. Fred Gerard, the interpreter for the Arikara scouts, witnessed the unfolding chaos from a distance. His testimony, consistent over the years, paints a grim picture of Custer's realization that he had led his men into a trap. When Custer grasped the full scope of the impending disaster, he made a desperate attempt to regroup his forces, but the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. The Sioux and Cheyenne descended on Custer's men with relentless force, leaving no room for retreat or escape. The speed with which the battle transformed from a calculated offensive to a massacre is one of the most shocking aspects of Little Bighorn. Custer, once hailed for his battlefield audacity, was undone by the very traits that had built his reputation: his boldness, refusal to retreat, and overconfidence in his abilities. He had severely underestimated both the numbers and the resolve of the native warriors, and by the time he recognized his error, it was too late. As the battle raged, the 7th Cavalry was quickly decimated. Despite Custer's efforts to rally his men, they were overwhelmed by a far superior force, using their knowledge of the terrain and determination to protect their families and land. By the end of the afternoon, Custer and all his men were dead, their bodies scattered across the battlefield in a devastating display of failure. The aftermath of the battle was just as inevitable as the defeat itself. The Sioux and Cheyenne had successfully defended their land, but the victory was bittersweet. They knew that the U.S. government would retaliate with overwhelming force. While they had won a significant battle, the loss at Little Bighorn marked the beginning of the end for the free-roaming tribes of the northern plains. The U.S. government soon launched a relentless military campaign to subdue the Sioux and Cheyenne, ultimately forcing them onto reservations and destroying their way of life. For the U.S. military, the defeat at Little Bighorn became a symbol of both Custer's bravery and misjudgment. Custer, once seen as an indomitable hero, became a figure of tragedy, a commander who underestimated his enemies and led his men to their deaths. The battle's legacy marked a turning point in the conquest of the American West, signaling the start of the U.S. Army's final push to subdue the native peoples and solidify control over their lands. The Battle of Little Bighorn serves as a stark reminder of the cost of hubris and miscalculation. It was a defeat that reverberated far beyond the battlefield, impacting both the native tribes and the U.S. Army, in ways that would shape the future of the American West. The aftermath, a legend is born. The aftermath of the Battle of Little Bighorn is as important to its legacy as the battle itself. Custer, who had died along with his men, was quickly transformed into a national hero. His death was framed as a noble sacrifice, a symbol of American bravery and perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. The myth of Custer's last stand took hold of the American imagination, and for years, the battle was remembered as a valiant, if tragic, moment in the country's westward expansion. However, as the years passed, the cracks in this narrative began to show. Historians, examining the evidence with a more critical eye, began to question the traditional story of Custer's heroism. What emerged was a far more nuanced picture, one in which Custer's own actions, his refusal to listen to his scouts, and his failure to recognize the strength of his enemies played a central role in his defeat. The myth of Custer as a martyr was slowly replaced by a more complex truth, that he had, in many ways, brought about his own downfall. Fred Gerard's testimony, along with those of other survivors, remains one of the most consistent and reliable accounts of the battle. Gerard's account sheds light on Custer's misinterpretation of the situation, his overconfidence, and the disastrous consequences of his decisions. And while Gerard's words cannot change the outcome of the battle, they provide valuable insight into the moments that led to the defeat of the Seventh Cavalry. As we look back on the Battle of Little Bighorn, it is clear that Custer's last stand was not the glorious moment of American history it was once portrayed to be. It was instead a story of hubris, miscalculation, and the harsh realities of war. The lessons of that day are still relevant today, reminding us that even the most celebrated leaders are fallible, and that history, more often than not, is written not by the victors, but by those who survive to tell the tale.